February 1959. The northern Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union sat buried beneath meters of compacted snow, silent and indifferent to everything below. 9 experienced hikers had set out from the city of Sverdlovsk 11 days earlier, carrying enough equipment for a Category 3 expedition, the most demanding classification in Soviet mountaineering. Their destination was the summit of Otorte Peak, a route that seasoned climbers in their group had attempted before. The expedition leader was Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old engineering student whose reputation for meticulous planning made him one of the most respected figures in Ural Polytechnic Institute's hiking club. By all measurable standards, this group was prepared, and yet not one of them would ever come home alive. The 9 members of the group were not strangers to the wilderness. Several had completed comparable expeditions in the same mountain range in previous years. Dyatlov himself had led groups through conditions that turned back lesser teams. Alongside him were Zinaida Kolmogorova and Ludmila Dubinina, 2 of the most physically capable women in the club. Rustem Slobodin, Yuri Doroshenko, Georgy Krivonishenko, Alexander Kolevatov, Nicholas Thibault Brignoles. The oldest member of the group, 38-year-old Semyon Zolotaryov, a decorated World War II veteran who had specifically requested to join the expedition just weeks before departure. The group left Sverdlovsk on January 23rd and reached the small settlement of Vizhai 5 days later. That was the last time any of them were seen in contact with the outside world. Their planned route took them northward along the eastern slope of Kholat Syakh, a peak whose name, in the language of the indigenous Mansi people of the region, translates roughly to Dead Mountain. The group had intended to pass through this terrain and continue toward Otorten. On the evening of February 1st, for reasons that would not be understood for decades, Dyatlov made the decision to set up camp on the exposed slope of Kholat Syakh itself, rather than descend into the sheltered valley below. The decision violated basic mountaineering protocol. Wind on the open slope reached speeds that made the temperature feel far lower than it actually was. Whatever prompted that choice would become one of the most debated questions in the entire investigation. When the group failed to return to Vizhai by the agreed-upon date of February 12th, their families contacted the institute. A search operation was organized, composed initially of student volunteers, then expanded to include military personnel and experienced search teams. On February 26th, searchers located the abandoned tent on the slope of Kholat Syakh. What they found there produced the first wave of dread that would only deepen in the weeks that followed. The tent had been cut open from the inside. The cuts were deliberate, made with a sharp blade, directed outward as though those inside had needed to exit the structure with extreme urgency and could not spare the seconds required to reach the entrance. Everything the hikers owned was still inside: shoes, outer clothing, food, equipment. Whatever had driven them out of the tent had done so with such force, such immediacy, that 9 trained and rational people had abandoned every material protection against a temperature of -30 degrees Celsius. Footprints in the snow led away from the tent in a relatively organized line, descending toward the tree line approximately 1.5 kilometers below. The prints showed that most members of the group had been either barefoot or wearing only socks. One investigator who arrived at the scene early noted that the footprints showed no signs of running or panic-driven scrambling. The group had walked, deliberately and together, away from the only shelter they had. The first 5 bodies were recovered in the weeks following the initial discovery. Igor Dyatlov was found approximately 300 meters from the tent, lying on his back in the snow with his face turned toward the camp. Zinaida Kolmogorova was found farther down the slope, also face up, her hands scratched and abraded. Rustem Slobodin was discovered between them, his skull bearing a small fracture that forensic examiners initially categorized as non-fatal. All 3 appeared to have died from hypothermia. Georgy Krivonishenko, and Yuri Doroshenko were found together near the remains of a small fire at the base of a large cedar tree. The tree itself bore evidence of something extraordinary. Its upper branches, reaching to a height of 5 meters, had been broken off. Someone had climbed that tree in the darkness and the cold. The medical examinations of the first 5 victims showed severe frostbite on the extremities, but no catastrophic internal trauma. The cause of death in each case was recorded as hypothermia. For a brief period, Soviet investigators considered the possibility that the group had simply become disoriented in a storm and perished from cold exposure. That explanation collapsed entirely when the remaining 4 bodies were recovered from beneath 4 meters of snow in a ravine 75 meters from the cedar tree in early May. The condition of those 4 bodies was categorically different from anything the search teams had encountered. The injuries were not consistent with the environment. They were consistent with tremendous force. Lyudmila Dubinina had suffered the fracture of 6 ribs on the right side and 5 on the left. Semyon Zolotaryov had 5 fractured ribs on his right side. Thibaut Brignol had sustained massive skull damage, a fracture of such severity that forensic examiners compared it to the kind of trauma produced by a high-speed vehicular impact. Alexander Kolovatov showed no equivalent skeletal injuries, though his body bore other post-mortem changes of note. The force required to produce the fractures found in Dubinina and Zolotaryov was later calculated to be equivalent to what a human body might absorb in a serious car accident or an explosion. No corresponding external injuries, no bruising of the skin surface consistent with blunt object contact were found. The force had come from somewhere, inside, or from a compression source that left no visible external mark. There was also the matter of Lyudmila Dubinina's tongue. It was absent. Her tongue, the soft tissue of her oral cavity, and her eyes were missing. Soviet forensic teams attributed this initially to post-mortem decomposition accelerated by water exposure, as the body had spent months in a meltwater stream. Later, independent analysis of decomposition rates in those conditions would generate substantial disagreement about whether natural processes could fully account for the degree of tissue loss observed. That detail alone, stripped of any dramatic embellishment, remained one of the most discussed anomalies in decades of subsequent forensic review. The official Soviet investigation closed in May 1959. The conclusion recorded in the final report stated that the group had died as a result of an unknown compelling force. That phrase, unprecedented in Soviet legal documentation, told investigators and researchers everything and nothing simultaneously. The case was classified. Files were sealed. The families of the victims were informed of the closure, without being given any substantive explanation for what had killed their children. For more than 3 decades, access to the original case materials was effectively impossible for anyone outside a small circle of Soviet officials. When the Soviet Union collapsed and archival materials became more accessible in the early 1990s, independent researchers began reconstructing the investigation from the original documents. What emerged was a picture of significant procedural incompleteness. Crucial forensic steps had not been taken. The precise sequence of events that led each individual from the tent to their final resting position had never been rigorously mapped, and the physical evidence, particularly the clothing of several victims, contained details that the original investigation had noted but never fully analyzed. Several garments had tested positive for abnormally elevated levels of radioactive contamination. Krivonishenko's clothing in particular registered readings that investigators at the time recorded and then categorized as inconclusive. The radioactivity finding produced the first major wave of alternative theories. Some researchers pointed to the known Soviet nuclear testing activity in the Ural region during the late 1950s. Others raised the possibility of military experimentation, parachute mines, or classified weapons tests conducted in the vicinity of Kholat Syakhl during that period. Soviet military infrastructure in the Urals during the Cold War era was extensive and frequently undisclosed. That much was established fact. Whether any specific military activity occurred in that precise location on that precise night remained unverifiable from open sources for many years. The radioactivity readings, however, never disappeared from serious analysis of the case. Among the most persistent and widely circulated theories was the hypothesis involving infrasound. Certain topographical configurations, particularly shaped valleys in mountain passes, are known to produce standing waves of low-frequency sound that human ears cannot detect, but that the human body can perceive. At specific frequencies, infrasound induces profound disorientation, irrational fear, visual disturbances. In some documented cases, a compulsion to flee an enclosed space. Researchers proposed that the geometry of the pass between Kholat Syakhl and the adjacent ridge could, under specific wind conditions, generate precisely these frequencies directly at the location where the tent was pitched. The group, experiencing a sudden and overwhelming sensation of panic with no identifiable external cause, would have cut their way out and fled. The infrasound hypothesis explains certain elements of the scene with reasonable coherence: the absence of any visible threat, the collective and apparently coordinated decision to abandon the tent, the calm, walking footprints rather than the chaotic scrambling of a group in visible danger. What it did not explain, at least not in isolation, was the catastrophic skeletal trauma found in the 4 bodies from the ravine. Infrasound does not fracture ribs. It does not shatter skulls. Whatever happened at the cedar tree and in the ravine below it required an additional mechanism. For decades, that mechanism remained the central unresolved problem. In 2019, the Russian Investigative Committee formally reopened the Dyatlov Pass case. The stated purpose was to apply modern forensic methodology to the original evidence and produce a definitive official conclusion. The committee's team worked for approximately 2 years, consulting avalanche dynamics specialists, meteorologists, forensic pathologists, and structural engineers. The investigation excluded criminal causes, extraterrestrial causes, and the involvement of any undisclosed Soviet military activity. The conclusion announced in 2021 pointed to a specific and unusual type of avalanche: a slab avalanche of limited but concentrated force as the primary cause of the injuries and the deaths. The slab avalanche theory, as developed and published in detail by researchers Johann Gaumo of the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology and Alexander Puzrin of ETH Zurich, proposed a mechanism that had not previously been considered because it contradicted initial assumptions about the terrain. The slope where the tent was pitched appeared, at first inspection, to be insufficiently steep to generate an avalanche. Standard avalanche modeling required a minimum slope angle that the Kholat Syakhl campsite did not obviously meet. However, Gaum and Puzrin demonstrated through computational modeling that a specific combination of factors could produce a delayed slab release on exactly such a slope. The hikers had cut into the snowpack to create a level platform for the tent. That cut altered the stress distribution in the snow layer above them. Throughout the night, new snow continued to accumulate. At some point in the early morning hours, the altered slab released, not a large avalanche, not the kind that buries and carries everything in its path, but a dense, compact slab of snow of perhaps 5 meters by 15 meters that slid directly over the tent. The weight and impact of that slab, transmitted through the tent fabric and directly onto the bodies of those sleeping beneath it, was calculated using modern computational models of snow density and impact force to be entirely consistent with the rib fractures and skull damage found in the 4 victims from the ravine. The injuries that had seemed impossible to explain through any conventional mechanism, the fractures without surface bruising, the internal compression damage without external marks, are in fact characteristic of exactly this type of localized snow slab impact. The tent fabric itself would have acted as a distribution layer, spreading force across the body rather than concentrating it at a single point of contact. That accounts for the absence of the surface bruising one would expect from a blow by a rigid object. The survivors of that initial impact, those not pinned or severely injured, would have cut through the tent to escape further collapse and descended toward the tree line in the only direction that offered any shelter. At the cedar tree, Krivonishenko and Doroshenko lit a fire and attempted to wait for the others. The branches they broke from the upper reaches of the tree were gathered as fuel. In the darkness and at those temperatures, without proper clothing, hypothermia progressed with brutal efficiency. Those who were still mobile attempted to return toward the tent after leaving what remained of their outer garments with the injured. Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin died on the slope during that attempt. The four in the ravine, the most severely injured from the initial slab impact, had been carried or had moved to the lowest point of the area and died there. Some sheltered partially beneath the snow that gathered over them through the remaining weeks of winter. The radioactivity found on certain garments remained a complication for the purely natural explanation. The most credible resolution offered by investigators familiar with the region's history pointed to the group's contact with contaminated equipment or materials during the earlier legs of the journey, possibly originating from other expedition members who had worked in facilities with low-level radiological exposure. Krivonishenko in particular had worked at the Mayak nuclear facility prior to the expedition. Trace contamination on personal clothing from that environment was documented in other workers from the same period. The readings found on the Dyatlov group's clothing were, by the measurements recorded, within a range consistent with secondary contact transfer rather than direct exposure to an active source. The Mansi people of the region, who had been investigated early in the Soviet inquiry as potential suspects, had no involvement whatsoever. Their knowledge of Koletsiakol as a place to be avoided, embedded in the mountain's very name, likely reflected a generational memory of exactly the kind of conditions that killed the Dyatlov group. Terrain that looked manageable and that delivered concentrated lethal force without warning. The indigenous understanding of that slope preceded the Soviet investigation by centuries. Zolotaryov's presence on the expedition continued to attract scrutiny from researchers unconvinced by the avalanche conclusion. His late addition to the group, his wartime background, certain details of his body's position and condition had fueled theories involving KGB surveillance and intelligence operations for years. No documentary evidence connecting his expedition participation to any intelligence activity was ever produced from the Soviet archives made accessible after 1991. The most complete independent review of his service records and personal history, conducted by Russian journalist and researcher Alexei Koskin, found no credible basis for the intelligence operative hypothesis. The camera equipment recovered from the tent and from the bodies produced photographs that have been analyzed extensively. Several frames show the group on the slope in what appear to be nighttime or low-light conditions. One frame in particular, heavily discussed in online communities, shows a blurred luminous shape that some researchers identified as a military flare or weather balloon and others left unidentified. Soviet military units did conduct parachute flare tests in the Ural region during this period. Eyewitness accounts from other hikers and a meteorological station reported orange spheres in the sky over the northern Urals on multiple nights in early February 1959. The formal Russian investigation concluded in 2021 with the avalanche determination, but the committee acknowledged that full certainty about every individual detail of the night of February 1st remained beyond the reach of current evidence. The tent, the original campsite markers, the physical snowpack of that specific winter no longer existed for analysis. The computational modeling produced by Gauman Puzrin was peer-reviewed and published in the journal Communications Earth and Environment. Withstanding the scrutiny of specialists in snow mechanics and avalanche dynamics who had no prior connection to the case, the fracture patterns matched, the force calculations matched, The delayed release mechanism explained the absence of any avalanche debris observed by the initial search teams in February, who had arrived weeks after new snowfall had obscured all surface evidence of the slide. What remained was not mystery in the sense that had animated 6 decades of speculation, but something closer to the particular darkness of a natural event that kills without malice or meaning. 9 people, competent and careful by every measure available to them, had made a single decision about where to place a tent on a slope that looked stable. Somewhere in the hours before dawn, the snow above them moved.